Good evening and welcome to this discussion tonight, the legacy of Richard M. Nixon, class of 1937. The panelists tonight, I think it's better to think of them as guests, are from the far end of the panel, Holsti, a professor of political science at Duke, Philip Lacovara, who was a counsel to the Watergate prosecution team, Randy Cook, whose effort this really is and who should be understood and given credit as the producer of the program. Ray Price, who served as the president's chief speechwriter from 1968 until 1974, and then beyond that was worked with the president in his retirement. And finally, though by no means least, the president's youngest brother, Edward Nixon, 17 years younger than the president, and I should add, importantly, member of the Trinity class of 1952. This panel is here to discuss the legacy of the president as an alum of the Duke Law School, and I think among them are eminently equipped to do so. I want to say just a word about miking and some of the technical aspects of the production this evening, and then I will ask Randy Cook to speak to you first about the thoughts that led him to assemble this group. In front of each seat you will find a mic embedded in the curved desk, and though they will not be activated yet, eventually they will be, and when the question and answer period comes at the end of the session, you'll be able to ask questions and engage in a colloquy with members of the panel. Panelists in the main presentations will stand at the podium and speak for about 20 minutes each, and then at the end of the sessions will speak briefly from where they sit, and at that point we'll open the session for questions and answers and comments. I'm delighted to be part of the group. I have no special claim as a Nixon expert. I have indeed nothing to offer other than that I was asked to act as moderator and unable to persuade Randy to find someone more suitable, eventually agreed. That's my entire claim, such as it is. Randy, if you'll begin by talking about the idea that led you to put this panel together.
Good evening and welcome. This panel is a product of Duke Law's most fascinating legacy. I doubt that any member of this community will confess that she chose Duke because Richard Nixon is a member of its alumni class. I doubt too, however, that there are many of us who did not know and contemplate that connection when we elected to make Duke Law a part of ourselves. The Nixon legacy speaks to each of us, and it is precisely because that man remains so it is precisely because of that speaking to us that the man remains so controversial. He summons us to aspire to great deeds. He stands as warning against the perils of hubris and of paranoia. And he imposes a duty of public service on we who have been given the great gift of a Duke education. When I arrived at Duke Law, I was struck by President Nixon's physical absence from the school. There are no portraits, no busts, no plaques, just an intense stare from out of the picture of the class of 1937. But Iron Butt Nixon's legacy lives on. In heated classroom debate, in irate email exchanges, in the pages of the school newspaper, The Devil's Advocate, and perhaps most importantly, in our individual mental conversations, his relevance is renewed by each of us each day. This event is a testament to that relevance. From the moment I broached the topic of having a panel discussion with the school administration, they have enthusiastically supported the event. Diana Nelson, Kurt Maletsky, and Dean Kate Bartlett have in particular been instrumental in bringing this event together. The faculty have been a tremendous resource for inspiration and funding. Without Professor David Lange, this evening's moderator, and Professor Chris Schrader, chair of the Duke program in public law, this event would not be possible. The student organizations listed in your program, as well as so many other individual student volunteers and individuals who have expressed interest, who I would like to point out come from across the spectrum of political opinion and interest represented here at Duke Law, have made this event a real success and what I hope to be will be a stunning event. The panelists themselves are each accomplished, busy gentlemen who have traveled from far and wide to share their perspectives with us. Finally, I would like to thank each of you for being here this evening. I know that we do not all share the same opinion of Richard Nixon, but your presence confirms that his legacy remains vitally essential to the institution that we want Duke Law to be, to the nation and the public life of that nation that we study and that we serve, and to the future of the world in which it is so vital that we be engaged. On that note, I turn the podium over to Professor Lange to commence the substantive portion of this evening's commentary.
Thank you, Randy. I want to begin the proceedings, or proceed with the proceedings, by quickly reminding us all of the signal dates and events in President Nixon's life. We all know the president, but it is, I think, unlikely, or know of the president. I think it is unlikely that we will remember all of these things, and I want to just quickly tick them off. The president was born on January 9th, 1913, in Yorba Linda, California, one of 5 sons born to Hannah and Francis Nixon. He was, among those 5 sons, the second oldest, and our guest this evening, his youngest brother, Edward, was born 17 years later, so there was some spread between President Nixon and his youngest brother, Edward. Nixon was educated in elementary and secondary schools through Yorba Linda, Whittier, and Fullerton. He graduated from the Whittier High School. He graduated second in his class from Whittier College in 1934, and then came to the Duke Law School, where he was third in his class of 1937. I believe that I may technically have violated the Buckley Act in disclosing this, but then who will sue? In World War II, the president served as a naval officer. He began as an ensign in 1942 and was promoted eventually to lieutenant commander, served principally in the South Pacific. In 1946, he entered public life, was elected to Congress, defeating Jerry Voorhees in 1946, re-elected in 1948, and then in 1950, in a closely contested election or contest against Congresswoman Helen Gagan Douglas, took a Senate seat and became a senator from California. In 1952, he was selected by Dwight Eisenhower to be Eisenhower's running mate. It was at that time that he was gave the celebrated Checkers speech that many of you will, well, some of you will recall, and the others of you will at least have heard about. This was in September of 1952. The Army McCarthy hearings followed in the spring of 1954 and on into the summer of 1954. And then in 1960, the Vice President of the United States, as President Nixon was at that time, ran, as you know, against John Fitzgerald Kennedy in an election in which the outcome was very close, and in which there were allegations of vote fraud, as there have been in many elections since. In 1962, having lost to President Kennedy in 1960, Mr. Nixon ran again for the governorship of California and lost, and it was in November 7th, on November 7th of that year in 1962, that he told the press, you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference. That was not quite so. In 1968, He won the presidential election by defeating Hubert Humphrey, as you know. He won by a plurality, 43%. It will astonish some of you to learn for the first time and intrigue some of you to remember that George Wallace received 13.5% of the electoral vote in that particular election. So those were truly very different times. This was in 1968. In 1972, however, the president was reelected by one of the larger majorities in the history of presidential contests. He defeated George McGovern with 60% of the vote. It was in that summer of 1972, as the president was moving forward toward what was, I think it's fair to say, perhaps in certainly political terms, his greatest triumph, the outcome of the election in November, that an office in the Watergate complex was broken into on June 17th, and by August 8, 1974, the president had chosen to resign. These are the details of his life that I think it's fair for us all to have in mind as we hear our guests speak individually of the things that they remember about the president in those years. We will proceed in this order because I think in this order you will hear a story that will engage you and will make some coherent sense. We'll hear first from Edward Nixon, the president's youngest brother, who will recall the president as a young man and as he grew older, a man who was about to embark upon a very public life. We will hear from Ray Price, who was in 1968 still working as a journalist in a very prestigious role indeed as a journalist, but who was persuaded by the president to join him in his effort to gain election in 1968, and who will speak particularly as to the president as a public man, although this isn't because, of course, the president became a public man in 1968, but because it's sensible to pick up the thread there. And then we will ask Ole Holsti, who is a professor of political science at Duke, to speak to the president's foreign policy and to his agenda as a leader. And then finally, we will ask Philip Lacovara, who was counsel to the Watergate Committee, but interestingly enough, before he became counsel to the Watergate Committee, actually a deputy solicitor general in the Nixon administration, to speak about those last two difficult years in the president's life as the leader of the nation. When those speeches have, or remarks have been finished, then we will have a very brief reprise, a kind of address to the president in his last years in Saddle River from Edward Nixon and from Ray Price. And at that point, we will actually invite and hope that you will join us in an exchange of conversation that will take the event further than it has been at that time. So, without more, I will ask Edward Nixon to begin this evening's proceedings. Edward, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward very much to what you have to say.
Randy Cook and I have to raise these things so that you can get close to the mic, but I think of myself as one who, when my brother died in 1994, I had known him longer than anyone alive. Certainly he had a legacy on my life which had an impact on Duke University because he succeeded in persuading me to avoid Stanford and come to Duke. The reason was, in those days, Duke had more of an international student body, and he thought I should be exposed to as much of that as possible, especially since he knew I wasn't going to be studying law, and I wasn't particularly interested in history, except prehistory as it pertained to geology. So here I came. Getting here to Duke came from many visits to the farm in Pennsylvania where my parents retired. I did my last year of high school in York, Pennsylvania, having finished all the rest of it in Whittier, California. So coming from Pennsylvania down to Duke was a lot easier than going all the way out to California anyway. But I still had lots of ties to the California scene. I was still a Californian. But Duke opened my eyes to something completely different from what we'd experienced out there. One of my roommates in the sophomore year, I think it was from Meshed, Iran. Another, the following year, was from Venezuela. And that exposure to the whole variety from Brazil, all these wide interests that they brought to the student body, I would carry back to Washington from time to time. When I was here, Dick was in Congress or in the Senate, and he would always ask, what are the students thinking? He never asked what the professors were thinking, because he really knew that the students were eventually going to be the professors, and besides, they were going to be voting soon. So I told him that in the social life on campus, I wasn't very much involved anyway, because in geology, you're down in the lab pounding on rocks, pulverizing samples, and then you go out on the field trips on the weekends and look at the tailings piles and the mess that the miners leave behind. And I described those things, and he said, well, what should we do about it? I said, well, you know, here we are. We're taking wealth out of the earth. This is the world of mining, and whether it's oil or minerals with metals in them or whatever, there's enough money coming out of there. We should take some of that, put it back to make it better than nature gave it to us. This was back in the early 50s now, mind you. Nothing really happened from that, except I really think that in the 60s, in the interregnum between the vice presidency and the run for presidency, I spoke to him again about this same issue. And he asked me, is this still true? It's still a mess out there. We need to clean it up. To me, it was most essential. So in 1969, Ray Price can probably recall this, we had a speech that he had to announce the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency. So pioneering in those fields was not something that came from some conservative Republican who wanted to favor all the industries. He said industry has to be favored, but industry has to take care of itself. We have to belong to an organization called WHO, WHO. We help ourselves. Other people on the other side of the aisle seemingly wanted to do something so that the government took care of all of it. Well, unfortunately, in my view today, looking back on the legal aspects of the Environmental Protection Agency, had he remained in office, we might have had a little bit more control on how far they could go, how far off track we can take it if we let things run wild in a government organization. We do need to control it, and the people need to control it. And after all, government doesn't create jobs. Industry creates jobs. Employers create jobs. And these ideas that I traded with Dick through the years kept holding me to the line of limited government. So I'm a Republican. Not necessarily true of all Republicans. Some of them want more government, more pork barrel, or whatever it takes to get elected. Not a good idea. The law school was here as a small part of the main quadrangle up there. Even had the name law up there, right underneath the balance of justice. Now the word's gone, but the balance is still there. Old chemistry was chemistry in those days, and now it's geology. And geology was absorbed by a thing called the Nicholas School of the Environment, and Ocean, Earth's Resources. And the geologists on campus, the professors, considered that move as something of it's a divergence. What is geology but the study of the earth? It means all the earth. And of course, as a geologist, I like to look at it that way. The environment, what was here before humans were here, what was before any life, what was here before the Big Bang, what's going to be here after we're all gone. The environment will still be here, but the tree falling in a forest with no people is making no noise, so here we go. I could carry this on beyond my school years, because I did do a few things in the campaign of '68 and the re-election campaign. In fact, that was the big one. Got into 45 states and made little penny-ante speeches about relationships with a brother that I admired greatly, and in the '72 campaign, to wind myself up here for Ray, I got to know those people over at the Re-elect Committee, but only briefly, because I was on the road. You're traveling one trip to another, and there's an advanced man out there receiving you, and you make a speech here or there. And those people got into trouble because it seemed to me that they interpreted what Dick was saying, as often we did with my father, who was a very boisterous and an opinionated man, and we would jump to the conclusion that's really what he wanted us to do. So they did a lot of things they shouldn't have done. And a lot of those things Dick didn't even know about, I'm convinced of that, until way down the road when he tried to defend them. Sometimes it doesn't pay to defend your friends if they've made a mistake, except to acknowledge the mistakes. To wind it up, I will say this. Richard Nixon's legacy on campus at Duke doesn't involve a portrait, not one that's painted by an artist. The legacy involves a portrait in the minds of millions of people around the world that I've had the privilege to meet. Not all million, mind you, but they're out there. And everywhere I go, especially China, there's a red carpet every time I visit there, and I've been there about 30 times. But in Europe, South America, Africa, West Africa, Ethiopia on the other side, always the best kind of reception I could get. Even had an interesting visit with Haile Selassie when he was Emperor of Ethiopia. Going to West Africa and Abidjan, Ivory Coast, Houphouët-Boigny, who recently passed away, was president, and I was supposed to have a 15-minute meeting and present Dick's book, La Vraie Guerre, which was first written in France, The Real War. And he was so impressed with my even being there that he extended the stay for an hour and a half, and his aide was trying to interrupt us, saying, "Time's up." He said, "Go away." So the impression that we get around the world is something different from what we have here, but Americans are coming back around. Why? Because the Nixon interest in students was the strongest of all. In fact, I've just started a foundation called the Nixon Education Foundation, a 501c3, and I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I'm committed to education. And I'm glad you're all here interested in this kind of subject. With that, I'd like to turn it on to Ray Price to continue for a while. I don't know if I've talked 20 minutes. I never time myself because I don't prepare notes. I don't write. I read the rocks and talk about them. I have rocks in my head. Ray Price.
Well, as you can see, I am going to inflict on some prepared remarks on you. I apologize for that, but I found, being out of practice as I am at this sort of thing, that I can get more into a given cubic unit of time and do it more accurately if I have it in front of me than if I'm trying to rely on my now rather rusty and faulty memory. And also, with apologies, I may trample a little bit on Oldie here and a couple of others, because in these I've gone a little bit beyond what David laid out as my franchise here. But at least if I do trample a little bit, you'll get some different perspectives on some of the same things, which will be very good. So anyway, we're here to discuss Richard Nixon's legacy. Each of us, both on the panel and in the audience, will measure that in his own way, by his own lights, and according to his own priorities. So we'll rate it differently. Some people prefer to measure not by the totality of his 80-year life, or even by his nearly half-century in the public arena, but solely by the way the presidency ended. I prefer the longer measure. I was a close associate of his for the last 27 years of his life. Those included his entire 5.5-year presidency, the 2 years before it, and a very productive 20 years afterwards. Over the years, I shared a lot of his working time, his thinking time, and his family time, the formal and the informal, the intense and the relaxed, the times of study, of contemplation, of decision, and sometimes of action. I think I got to know him pretty well. Not completely, but pretty well. During these few introductory minutes, I'll just try to give a brief overview of some of what to me were the important things, what he tried to do in the world and did, and why and how, and why I firmly believe that eventually he'll be rated as among America's best presidents, but only after the evaluations are no longer being made or so heavily influenced by those who, in the media and elsewhere, who built their own reputations on the devil theory that they so largely shaped. And an absolutely essential element of understanding his presidency, as an absolutely element, I'll touch on some of the background against which, in office, he was trying to do all of this. I'm sure that in the question time we'll have a chance to get into some of the other things, including the final battles, and I'll be glad to do so then. But at this point, I will say one thing up front. I fought the Watergate battle alongside him, including working closely with his lawyers and being his collaborator on all of his Watergate speeches, as well as his resignation announcement, because I believed then, as I believe today, that we were on the right side of that battle. At the end, I did recommend resignation, but not because I thought it was deserved, rather because by then it was clear that the political battle was lost, and it was a political battle, and so it was better that he ended quickly and cleanly. His was an extraordinarily complex personality. Think of a giant crystal ball with thousands of facets, each reflecting light in a different way, and it may help you understand how so many people could see him in so many different ways, and also how so many viewers of that crystal ball can easily take from it the reflections they choose to take. I'm not immune from that, neither are his detractors. One thing that complicates assessment is that from his first days in public life, he was always a polarizing figure, both immensely admired and intensely detested, depending mostly on the viewer's politics. Interestingly, though, here at Duke Law School, before he was thrust into those divisive public controversies, he was not a polarizing figure at all. Far from it. From all the reports that I've seen, he was diligent in his studies, helpful to his classmates, respectful to and respected by his teachers. One classmate who remained a good friend as long as they both lived was Charlie Ryan, a very distinguished president of the American Bar Association. Nixon himself here at Duke ended up on the Law Review, third in his class, Order of the Coif, and as the elected president of the Student Bar Association, Student Law Society, rather. Not bad for a fellow who had to struggle to work his way through law school during those deep Depression years, saving money, among other ways, by sharing with three friends a one-room clapboard house a mile away from campus that didn't even have heater or indoor plumbing. Before becoming president, he had already been at the center of national and international controversy for more than 20 years. He'd also been a significant figure on the world stage for 16 years, first as the most traveled vice president in history, and then as a private citizen, as the friend, counselor, and confidant of presidents, prime ministers, and foreign ministers on every continent. To his friends, he was admirable, courageous, insightful, bold, shrewd, with a driving sense of responsibility toward the nation and the world, together with a cannily realistic understanding of the world's ways. One relatively minor, but to me very telling incident from a trip I took with him throughout Asia in the spring of 1967, nearly 2 years before he became president, has stood out to me ever since as an example of those qualities. We arrived in New Delhi at a time of high tension, not only between India and Pakistan, but also between India and the US. India had recently been very angered by a change in America's arms supply policies that it thought favored Pakistan. Tensions were high and tempers short. The US ambassador to India then was a veteran Democratic politician, a former governor of Connecticut, Undersecretary of State in the Kennedy administration, Chester Bowles. The night we arrived, Bowles had us over for a quiet private dinner in the garden of the embassy residence. This was a serious private study trip, one of 4 Nixon would take that year to different parts of the world in preparation for what might become a campaign and then might also become the presidency. On these trips, he kept a deliberately low profile, assiduously avoiding press conferences. But over dinner that night, Bowles asked him, please, to meet with the press at the embassy the next day and explain to the Indian and other media the rationales for America's actions. Reluctantly, but out of a sense of duty, a characteristic sense, I might say, he agreed. So the next day, without any notes or briefings, in a huge room crammed with reporters, he spent a full hour fielding mostly hostile questions about U.S. policies, never criticizing, always explaining, often in elaborate and sophisticated detail, trying to help the reporters and their audiences understand why the U.S. was acting as it was. It was a stunning tour de force. When it was over, Ambassador Bowles took us aside, thanked Nixon profusely, and described it as the best thing that had been done in years for Indian-American relations. Now, in the sweep of history, that one small incident rates no more than a tiny asterisk. But to me, it tells a great deal about Richard Nixon. And it's entirely in character with the Richard Nixon I knew. Only the most skilled diplomatist could have fielded the questions as he did in that situation. He walked the fine line between Indian and Pakistani sensitivities and brought to it a minute understanding of the nuances of the troubled relations on the subcontinent, as well as between its feuding nations and the United States. And only a candidate who was a statesman first and a politician second would have handled himself in that way. Speaking instinctively on behalf of the U.S. in that hostile environment, he defended and explained the actions of the administration that he was planning to run against, without placing any shred of distance between himself and that administration. Now, any president has to play the hand that he's dealt. It's easy these days to forget the conditions under which Richard Nixon took office. From start to finish, his was probably the most fiercely embattled presidency of any except Abraham Lincoln's, and Lincoln faced an actual civil war. Nixon was the first president in 120 years, to enter office with both houses of Congress already against him, or already controlled by the opposition party, I'll say it more kindly. He inherited a bitterly unpopular war half a world away, with more than 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. And he inherited the ravages of the 1960s, when civility was drained from public discourse, when riots and bombings and the burnings of whole sections of cities captured the fancies of the glitterati, a nation tearing itself apart in an orgy of shrillness and violence unprecedented in American history. One of his first pleas in his inaugural address was that we, quote, lower our voices, end quote. And for a brief while, the shrillness and violence did subside, but not for long. From the safe remove of the present, the threats presented by the nation's romance with violence back then are easily forgotten. But listen carefully to a few numbers. From January 1969 through April 1970, the crucial beginning months of our administration, more than 40,000 bombings, attempted bombings, and bomb threats were inflicted on the United States by Americans. The spiritual center of that violence was the college campus. In the single school year 1969-70, violent college campuses were torn by 347 cases of arson, 282 violent attacks on ROTC facilities, 1,792 demonstrations, 7,561 arrests, 8 people killed, and 462 injured, including 299 police. These and many other related assaults were among the concrete problems with which, as president, he had to deal. Beyond that, they were symptomatic of the climate in which he had to try to lead the nation. And in the final battle of the Nixon presidency, Watergate, we looked out from the White House and saw confronting us once again many of those same adversaries. The nation in those years was also bitterly torn north against south and black against white. One of the toughest nuts to crack was school desegregation. 15 years after Brown won, 14 years after in Brown 2, the Supreme Court ordered dismantling of the dual school system with all deliberate speed. It was still almost entirely segregated. The conventional wisdom that desegregation couldn't be done peacefully. He cracked that nut. In the fall of 1970, the dual school system ended, and it ended peacefully. He achieved that by treating the South not punitively as had been so fashionable, but rather with a combination of respect and firmness, drawing the opponents into the process and putting in place an entirely new structure of biracial committees at state and local levels throughout the South in which blacks and whites together strove to make the inevitable work. They did, and it did. After 15 years of saying no, it took a President Nixon's vision and courage to make it happen and happen peacefully. In the larger world, when he took office, NATO was in disarray, and SEATO, our Southeast Asian alliance, was an empty shell. In the wake of the Six-Day War of 1967, the Middle East was a cockpit of potentially explosive conflict, with most of the Arab nations considering America their second worst enemy after only Israel itself. Mainland China glowered at us in seemingly implacable hostility. In Vietnam, there had been no cohesive plan in operation either to end the war or to win it. And hanging over everything for the long term was a bitter rivalry between the nuclear superpowers. Once inaugurated, he set out immediately to begin changing all of that. Within days of taking office, about 5 days actually, he ordered a secret planning for an opening to China. Less than 5 weeks into his presidency, he made a tour of European capitals and began building a new spirit of unity within NATO, an essential precondition for the new relationship he sought to establish with the Soviet Union. In the Middle East, he patiently worked out a new balance, saving Israel in its darkest hour, yet at the same time restoring the historic friendship between the U.S. and the Arab states. And 6 months after taking office, at a news briefing on the island of Guam, he laid out what became the Nixon Doctrine. And incidentally, that had been foreshadowed in an article which happened to be my first writing collaboration with him, which appeared in the October 1967 issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, called Asia After Vietnam, which not only foreshadowed this, but also included his first public flagging of what would become the opening to China. In effect, that doctrine was that we would remain a Pacific power, but our commitments abroad would be determined by our own national interests, and we would help our friends defend their independence rather than fight their wars for them. With the Soviet Union, he built painstakingly toward a new and more stable relationship, one that took fully into account the two powers' conflicting interests and ambitions, but built on their common interests. He was never deluded into equating disarmament with peace. He knew that America's military strength and visible firmness of resolve were essential to any stable U.S.-Soviet relationships. But at the same time, he sought to weave a fabric of economic and other interdependencies that would make the Soviets think twice before tearing it. In a lifetime spent in the arena, he knew both great defeats and great victories. In the arena central to his life was the one in which, throughout his career, Western civilization was playing out its climactic conflicts, in which it confronted the forces of war and tyranny. It was in this arena that he welcomed China into the world, that he fashioned a new pattern of relationships among the great powers, that he made that pattern possible by holding fast in Vietnam, that he sought to strengthen the Western nations and shore up their will, while reaching out to the emerging nations to keep them from succumbing to the aggressor's ambitions. These were not small matters. Richard Nixon was not a trivial person. He was far more than a politician. He was preeminently what the French call an homme sérieux, a man of large vision who knows the world, whose actions are both calculated and consequential, and whose views carry weight. In the arena in which he fought, many of the victories were on issues that still continue to shape the world in this new century. And millions of people too young to remember the defeats will live more securely because of those victories. Thank you.
Actually, Ray talked about possibly a different perspective. I don't think there's a whole lot of difference of opinion on foreign affairs. Let me first thank Randy for inviting me here. Secondly, just a personal note, some of you may recall it was not too long after I arrived at Duke that there was quite a fierce battle on this campus about whether the Nixon Library should be located here. I was on the losing side of that. I still think that it would have been a fantastic facility to have, and it'd be great to be able to send students to read primary materials. They're not going to be sent to Yorba Linda for writing undergraduate papers. I think Ray has already touched upon, I think, the two things that were most important in terms of the background when Nixon took office. He was not dealt a good hand. Domestically, we were being torn apart. Both political parties were being torn apart by the issue of Vietnam. The domestic consensus on foreign affairs that had existed through roughly the early 1960s had pretty much disappeared. Internationally, an interesting thing was happening. Americans were very used to, in the media and elsewhere, to talk about the Sino-Soviet bloc, but there seemed to be some evidence that that bloc was coming unraveled. the alliance of February 1951 was becoming a dead letter. There was actually fighting going on between Soviet and Chinese troops along the Ussuri River. And interestingly, the Chinese were producing some atlases that showed the real territory of China, included some territory that had been stolen, according to the Chinese, by the czars in the 19th century. So that both internationally and domestically, these, I think, are important developments. Now, it would take 20 days to talk about Richard Nixon's foreign policy. I think he was the very opposite of Bill Clinton, who said, "Is the economy stupid?" With Nixon, I think the interest was more on international affairs. Now, what I want to do is focus a little bit on how he viewed the world and how he viewed that the U.S. ought to adjust itself to a rapidly developing world. I think he perceived, and here I'm not going to get into the question of whether it was Kissinger or Nixon. I'm going to assume that the president called most of the shots. He perceived an emerging world in which there are 5 major centers of power: the United States and the Soviet Union, of course, the Cold War antagonists; China, which was emerging as a power of its own; Japan, which was certainly not a military power, but it was emerging as a major economic power; and Europe, which was taking significant steps toward, at least Western Europe, towards unification. In Nixon's view, this opened up opportunities for going beyond the 2 thoughts that I think that dominated the Eisenhower and Kennedy administration. One, the domino theory, which was actually articulated by Dwight Eisenhower when describing the developments in the French War in Indochina, talking about the fact that if one domino falls, they will continue to knock over others until you have real problems at home. And the other, the kind of the zero-sum view of the world, which is that any gain that the Soviets make is necessarily our loss and vice versa. Ray has already talked about the Guam speech. In the Guam speech, I think we begin to get the view that we are not automatically going to be committed everywhere, particularly with American forces in protecting allies in that part of the world. The China opening is, I think, probably the most interesting of the developments here. As Ray pointed out in his Foreign Affairs article of October 1967, he already gave some hints that it was time for rethinking some aspects of American foreign policy. At that time, I think it's fair to describe that China was the third rail of American politics. When Dwight Eisenhower met with Jack Kennedy in the transfer of power in 1960s, winter of 60-61, Eisenhower told Kennedy that he would be cooperative. He would not take public stands. If ever Kennedy wanted his advice, he'd be happy to do it, but he was essentially going to retire, except if Kennedy took moves towards recognizing mainland China, Eisenhower would become quite vocal in opposing that. We had at that time the loose publishing empire strongly opposed to any recognition of China, the Committee of 1 Million, a very powerful interest group. All of these made the issue of opening to China certainly a controversial one. Nixon was able, because he had impeccable anti-communist credentials. There was no question about where he stood on the issues of the U.S. versus Soviet Union and so on, was able to do, acting with a considerable secrecy, what probably no Democrat could have done, at least at that time. When he met with Mao Zedong on his trip to China, he told Mao Zedong that only a rightist could do what I am doing, that is, speaking to you, coming to visit you in China. And Mao is reputed to have said, "I like rightists," which is one of history's little ironies. I think that the interest in China was not simply that here is an exotic country that had been sort of off limits to Americans for many years, but rather that if you view the world with emerging centers of power other than just the U.S. and the Soviet Union, that to use the term that was sometimes used at that time, he played the China card. In 1969, the Soviets had actually approached the United States about a joint effort to blow up the Chinese nuclear facilities, and Nixon the Nixon administration turned that down. With respect to Russia, Ray, I think, has already pointed out the main feature, and that is that the policy was of détente, as it was called, was essentially going to be one of carrots and sticks. That is, the sticks were going to remain very much in evidence, the main sticks being containment, that is, with alliances, of which the most important was obviously NATO, and deterrence, with the massive nuclear capabilities that we had, although the Soviet Union was developing equally important capabilities. But these were to be augmented with a variety of carrots, which I want to get to in a moment. As Ray pointed out, the whole notion here was that of linkages and interdependence. If the Soviets wanted to nibble on the carrots, they had to also be prepared to behave well in other arenas. In terms of strategic capabilities, the notion of sufficiency, what is sufficient to deal with the worldwide threat that might come from the Soviet Union, was sort of supplemented or replaced the idea that of ever-growing capabilities. At one point before Congress, Kissinger was asked about this, and he said, what in the name of God does superiority mean in an era when both powers are capable of blowing each other up many, many times? The focus on the Soviet Union was very definitely going to be on Soviet external behavior, not on how the Soviets dealt with their own citizens. Very much the kind of realist notion that states are sovereign, that what they do to their neighbors is of concern to the international community. What they do to their own citizens is much less concern. And I want to come back to that in a moment in talking about the carrots. Of the carrots, arms control was certainly one of them. The SALT I Treaty was the first of the major arms control agreements. It had with it the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which put a cap on and ultimately terminated at that point the defensive capabilities arms race. Trade and credits would be available to the Soviet Union. That never really quite came to fruition in the way that it was perceived because of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. The Congress put stipulations that the Soviets would not be eligible for some of these carrots unless they really agreed that there would be unlimited immigration, particularly of Jews from the Soviet Union. Crisis control measures, that is, the two sides agreed that they would notify each other about developing situations that threatened to perhaps escalate to the point that they engaged the two superpowers. One of the things that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the recognition by Khrushchev and Kennedy that the old diplomatic process of talking to each other took about 8 hours, that was not good enough in an era when it took only 30 minutes for missiles to go from one side to the other. And so the so-called hotline was established, which enabled leaders, the two leaders, to be able to speak directly with each other. And I think that the arms control was really quite important for Nixon. The follow-up was to be the SALT II Treaty. It was, as the Nixon presidency was getting in increasing trouble as a result of Watergate, one of the arguments that the president made repeatedly was that it was important for him to be able to stay in office because that process was important, the process that he had initiated and hoped to come to fruition. With respect to the key issue of Vietnam, the hope was that by trying to develop a more stable set of relationships with the other two powers, both of which were supporting the North Vietnamese, that the U.S. could extricate itself from this quagmire, but to do so without the loss of prestige and without the loss of face. The peace of 1973, we know, didn't last very long. It was David Lange before raised the question when we were speaking before this meeting as to whether that might have turned out differently had Nixon been able to fulfill his term through January 1977. It's one of those interesting things that we have no way of knowing. Certainly, the Paris Peace Agreement came unraveled rather quickly. The South Vietnamese army turned out to be certainly less than we had hoped that it might be. With respect to the rest of the world, one of the concomitants of the Guam speech was to try to buttress certain key regional actors to look after American interests, stability in the world, and the one I just mentioned, Iran, at that point was awash with petrodollars, and the Shah of Iran was allowed to buy a great many non-nuclear American arms. The notion was the Shah of Iran at one point was talking about Iran by the year 2000 would be the world's third great superpower. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way, but the general notion was that in this more complex world, that other key nations would be able to look after U.S. interests. I'll just mention a couple of other brief events. The intervention in Chile, which still is controversial, and the other is the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971 as a result of weakening American dollar, the outflow of gold. The result was that at the international level, the link between the dollar and the gold was severed, just as the Roosevelt administration in 1933, for domestic purposes, had severed the link between the dollar and gold. Well, just as sort of a concluding scorecard, certainly the China opening, it seems to me, is the most important of these developments. It didn't solve all of the problems. The problem of Taiwan remains, and it remains a major potential irritant between the two nations. Détente started the process of stabilization with the Soviet Union, but it began to come unraveled with the Yom Kippur War, where there was the Soviet understanding of détente was that it didn't apply to the Third World. Our understanding was that it applied worldwide. The strategy that I think went along with this has sometimes been called the Third World averaging strategy. Yes, we might lose in some parts of the world, let's say Vietnam, but we might gain, picking up, for example, the support of Egypt, which had become soured on their relationship with the Soviet Union, by and large, probably a net gain. I think in conclusion, what Nixon faced was a bad hand. He looked at the world through realist lenses, saw the opportunities for rethinking relationships between the major powers, and his was a foreign policy that was largely focused on the relationship between the major powers. By and large, it seems to me he gets pretty good grades in the foreign policy arena.
And now as Philip Lacovara makes his way up, let us shift the dimensions of our thinking to realize what was taking place in these last 2 years. And it does, I think, invite us to rethink what we have just been hearing. June of 1972, a Watergate break-in in little more than 2 years, the resignation of a president who had gained re-election in 1972 by an overwhelming majority. And in that period of time, one of the great and most dramatic series of events in the history of the nation. Philip Lacovara, who participated in the Watergate prosecution, will address himself to these events. Think as he speaks about what it meant to the country, to those those of you here who were then able to participate and to observe, to see this president move from a position of considerable power and great prestige, some of it at least surely deserved, to a position in which finally he is obliged to resign and to leave the nation's capital, waving farewell from the side of a helicopter, and on his way briefly to California, and then finally to Saddle River, New Jersey, where he spent his last years. These were great and dramatic events, and Philip Lacovara will speak to those finally. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's delightful to be back here at Duke. I was last here 25 years ago at a conference on presidential power, and I'm happy to say the law school looks a lot brighter and convivial than it did even then. It was stately then, but now it's a modern gem. My colleagues on the panel have explain to you some of the positive features of Richard Nixon, the man, Richard Nixon, the political figure, Richard Nixon, the international diplomatist. My task is to discuss Richard Nixon's legacy for American public law. And here, sadly, the record is much more mixed. I think it's fair to say that with the possible exception of Franklin Roosevelt, no president in American history has had a more significant or more dramatic or more pervasive impact on American public law than Richard Nixon. Some of it good, much of it not good, at least from the perspective of the president himself and some of his successors. I want to roll back a little bit to the events prior to Watergate to give you a perspective of my own, which I carried with me into the Watergate Special Prosecution Force. And I'm always diffident when I'm speaking to an audience that consists mainly of law students when I speak about Watergate, because all of the events that were so formative in my life and in the lives of some of the other people on our panel were, to you, pre-birth events. If you know about them, you know about them as dry history. But as David just said, during the Watergate period, the 2 years or so from late 1972 through President Nixon's resignation in 1974, this was the dominant story. There has been nothing since then in your life that has been so dominant in the public consciousness. It was always leading the nightly news. Several minutes. In fact, one of the network correspondents, a man named Fred Graham, had taken a job. He'd been a Washington Post Supreme Court reporter and had taken a job in a new field. And to those of you who are in law school today, when the media are dominated by legal stories and legal television shows, it was a new role on a network to have a law correspondent. And Fred Graham signed on, and he said midway through Watergate, when he was on 2 or 3 minutes a night on CBS, he told me he had regretted that the contract he had signed had offered him an option of either going to a flat fee basis or a per minute of airtime basis. And as he signed on right before Watergate began, and obviously he would have been quite more successful if he'd done it on a per minute basis. But my experience going into this Watergate affair was as a person who had the kind of enthusiasm about Richard Nixon as president that some of my colleagues on the panel had an understandable reason for sharing. I was at that point a very young lawyer. Sarah North will be shocked to know that I was a Republican, actually voted for Richard Nixon both times. And in the spring of 1973, I was serving in the Nixon administration, in a sense. I was Deputy Solicitor General in charge of criminal and internal security cases in the Supreme Court, when Archibald Cox, who had just been appointed special prosecutor, asked me if I would come and be his counsel, his principal legal advisor. And I was, I think it's fair to say, one of the few Republicans in the office, although that fact was quickly obliterated because I'd also worked once for Thurgood Marshall. So when the political battle about whether Watergate was just a Kennedyite plot to get President Nixon or was a legitimate effort to enforce federal criminal law, the opponents of the Watergate special prosecution emphasized my association with Thurgood Marshall rather than my Republican credentials and my service in the Nixon administration. But it was in that context that I came to regret what I was involved in doing, not because I regretted that we had to do it, but I regretted that it did mean the end of a presidency that might have offered a lot more to the country. I say Richard Nixon had a tremendous impact on American public law, not only because of the Watergate tapes case, about which I would like to spend a few minutes discussing, but because the president was the named party in no fewer than 4 Supreme Court decisions. No other president has such a distinction. Those decisions established important constitutional principles about the presidency and about the president's role in American public life. But beyond that, the president's involvement in Watergate, and Ray said the president was great, had made tremendous strides in American policy, but for Watergate, and Ray said he believed that the Nixon administration was on the right side of Watergate. I think the involvement of the president in the Watergate scandal, which led to his personal tragedy of resignation, also has had enormous impacts on American public life, on our American political system. I'd like to talk about those as well. But let me describe the most important of the 4 decisions in which President Nixon was personally involved. It's referred to as the Nixon tapes case. As David said, I believe, I argued that case in the Supreme Court in 1974. It grew out of the investigation and prosecution of President Nixon's senior White House aides and former Attorney General John Mitchell and a re-election campaign manager, men who were accused and later convicted of having been involved in a conspiracy to cover up responsibility for a break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in 1972, in the midst of the national political campaign. What was involved in the case, for those of you who may not have studied con law and certainly did not live through the era, were a series of fundamental constitutional questions. It had emerged during the course of a congressional inquiry that President Nixon had a surreptitious eavesdropping system in the Oval Office, as well as in his executive office building office, which was activated automatically when anyone spoke in the office. That meant that there was going to be contemporaneous evidence of the conversations between the president and people who were already suspected of having been involved in the conspiracy. It was not known at that point whether President Nixon himself was personally involved in the cover-up conspiracy, and if so, to what extent. So the threshold question, as soon as this bombshell of a revelation came to light, that there was tape in the Oval Office, as one of President Nixon's assistants testified, was what to do about it. Should the Watergate special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, try to demand the production of those tapes, which the president said he would not release voluntarily? And the issue was, is there a right on the part of a prosecutor, in a constitutional sense, an inferior officer in the executive branch of government, to demand from the chief executive, in whom the Constitution reposes the responsibility for taking care that the laws be faithfully executed, evidence the president refused to provide himself. Now, Cox, and I've said in other remarks that there were 2 special prosecutors during the relevant period. There were 2 more afterwards, Archibald Cox and then Leon Jaworski. Both of them, in my view, were the right men for the job at the right time, and they were very fundamentally different. Cox was a Harvard Law School professor. He'd been a Solicitor General, cared deeply about constitutional law, almost in an abstract sense. He'd never been a prosecutor, never conducted a grand jury, but was concerned about what I would call the public law issues that the Watergate confrontation posed. And when we sat down that first afternoon to discuss what to do, Cox and his assistant and I brainstormed what was the right course to take. And the way he analyzed it was as follows. The president was invoking something called executive privilege, which courts at that point were still wrestling with. There had never been a reliable determination whether there is such a thing as executive privilege, and what its foundation might be, a mere testimonial privilege or something rooted in the Constitution. And the way Cox saw it, if he went ahead, demanded this evidence from the president, which the president refused to give, there were 2 possible outcomes. The courts might rule that the president had an absolute privilege to refuse to turn over this information, in which case, as Archie saw it, he would have demonstrated exactly the opposite of what his office, as he saw it, was designed to accomplish, which was to demonstrate to the American people that no man in this country, including the president, is above the law, and that all are to stand equal before the law. But suppose, he speculated, the courts, as they ultimately did, decide that there is a right to get this evidence. And suppose, as the president continued to dangle before us and the American people for the next year, the president refused to comply with a court order to turn over the tapes. In that respect, there were also two alternatives, neither of which seemed very sanguine in 1973, and neither of which was very sanguine in 1974 when we ultimately argued before the Supreme Court. Either the president would defy the courts and get away with it, in which case Cox would have provoked a constitutional crisis that again would have demonstrated most fundamentally that the president can disregard the law. The alternative was, if the president defied a court order overturning a privilege claim and something was done about it, there could be a change of government, impeachment and removal from power. That was, in fact, the course that was about to take place when the president, in the end of the first week of August 1974, resigned shortly after the Supreme Court issued the tapes decision, unanimously commanding him to turn over the tapes to the trial court. A couple of words about the decision itself and the events leading up to it. There was a lot of tactical byplay that went into the way we postured the case, and one of my roles as counsel to the special prosecutor was to advise on these tactical questions. As you may have noticed, if you've studied any of the other cases in the era, most of these disputes arose on matters of mandamus. So the earlier decision was styled Nixon versus Sirica. When the case that went to the Supreme Court went to the Court of Appeals, after the trial judge had demanded that the president produce evidence for the trial of his former aides, he also sought relief in the Court of Appeals in a case called Nixon versus Sirica, the trial judge. We decided to go immediately to the Supreme Court without awaiting a decision in the Court of Appeals, a very unusual procedure, and there were several reasons for doing that. One was to expedite the procedure, but another was to give us the chance to claim something that may seem to you petty, but seemed to us to be very significant in demonstrating our position, the soundness of our position on the ultimate constitutional merits. We wanted to be able to name the case. And the caption that we assigned in our petition for certiorari was the United States of America versus Richard Nixon. And the point of that presentation was to say, so long as the special prosecutor was in office, he spoke for the United States, for the sovereignty of the United States, had all of the powers to execute the law that exists under Article 2 of the Constitution, and that in this litigation, Richard Nixon happened to be president, but was simply a witness in possession of material evidence. We also did some other things that tended to corroborate that view of the balance, which, on my view, may have picked up one or two of the votes in the unanimous decision. But it was, I think, important in laying the foundation for demonstrating the ultimate constitutional point that the special prosecutor could demand evidence wherever it lay, including in the hands of the president, and that the president could not irrevocably make a decision not to produce this information for the trial jury to determine the guilt or innocence of the president's own aides. The decision was, as you, those of you who lived through it know, unanimous, which was fundamental because the president had left open the possibility he would not obey a decision that was not definitive. And in my closing rebuttal argument to the court, I asked the court to affirm what Judge Sirica had done unanimously and definitively for that very purpose. And the court, happily enough, was unanimous. And the president ultimately decided, because his political base eroded, that he had no choice but to comply with the subpoena. But at bottom, the decision was, from the standpoint of the American presidency, a victory. A point I think too little noticed. Up until that time, executive privilege had a very shaky claim to validity, if any. What the Supreme Court ruled, however, is that there is an executive privilege, and it is derived from the constitutional separation of powers. It is a very profound privilege, generally to be respected. As a result of that decision, although the court decided that the privilege had to yield in the unique circumstances of that criminal trial, there has been in the last 25 years a dramatic upsurge in the assertion of executive privilege. Every president since President Nixon has invoked executive privilege far more often than President Nixon has, and in virtually all instances the courts have sided with the president. So if one looks at the impact on the presidency of the Nixon tapes decision, what it did was to strengthen the hand of the president in withholding information from those who might be seeking it, including congressional committees. There is, as you may know, a current battle today over executive privilege between the vice president, as a member of the presidential circle, and the Congress over some Enron-related materials concerning visits to the White House Oval Office during energy policy making. Another one of the president's major involvements in personal litigation is a case that was decided 8 years after he left office. It's called Nixon versus Fitzgerald. And in that case as well, the presidency, including in this instance the president himself, the former president himself, wound up the winner. In that case, a lawsuit brought by a former federal employee who claimed that he had been illegally discharged from federal office for being a whistleblower about some Defense Department mismanagement. This whistleblower, Mr. Fitzgerald, sued both President Nixon and several of the White House people with whom Ray worked. And in a companion decision involving Bryce Harlow, one of the president's advisors, the Supreme Court decided that, like any other executive branch official, only qualified privilege would be available to them. But in the Nixon case, Nixon against Fitzgerald, the court ruled that the president's role in the American constitutional system as chief of state and head of a branch is unique, and he is absolutely immune from any lawsuits relating to activities within the outer perimeter of his responsibilities. Now, that decision was very much on the mind of President Bill Clinton when he resisted the lawsuit, sexual harassment lawsuit filed against him by Paula Jones. That case went to the Supreme Court with the President Clinton, claiming that as a corollary to the Nixon against Fitzgerald case, an incumbent president is absolutely immune from any kind of civil lawsuit because any kind of lawsuit would distract him from discharging his functions as chief of state, and that the mere private interests of a claimant should yield to the president's constitutional status. The Supreme Court, however, gave short shrift to that decision and decided in a case that remains controversial that President Clinton had to answer that suit. One thing then led to another, and as you know, as a corollary of that claim, the special prosecutor or independent counsel had been appointed to investigate some of President Clinton's financial investments, obtained jurisdiction over some other sexual escapades in which President Clinton was supposedly involved, asked the president under oath whether he'd had a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky, and the president was required to answer under the Nixon tapes decision, could no longer claim an absolute privilege to avoid involvement in a criminal process, and as a result of what appeared to have been false statements under oath, was promptly impeached by the House of Representatives, sharing that dubious distinction with only Andrew Johnson, and survived conviction and removal from office by only several votes. Nevertheless, the chain of constitutional events that began in the Nixon administration had these repercussions for the presidency of Bill Clinton. The two other constitutional decisions in which the president was involved personally involved his presidential papers. The subject of the presidential library has been mentioned here this evening. By tradition, presidents took their papers with them when they left. They were regarded as their personal property, and they did with them as they would. In what I think it's fair to say was a decision partly motivated by the Watergate scandal and partly by the then congressional mistrust of President Nixon personally, Congress changed the rules of the game, passed a statute saying that the General Services Administration, the federal government's housekeeping agency, should take custody of these papers, 40 million pages of them, plus all of the White House tapes, archive them, and then ultimately make them available for historical and other research purposes. The President challenged that decision on a variety of constitutional grounds, Bill of Attainder, First Amendment, several others, invasion of privacy, and as well as executive privilege, and lost in a closely divided vote on that, setting a precedent now which binds all future presidents that presidential papers are deemed to belong to the public, although there may be some compensation that has to be paid for the inconvenience of being subjected to the seizure of those materials that are created in the presidential office. Another much less significant decision in the grand scheme of things that involved President Nixon personally was the Warner Communications case, which involved demand by the press for access to the Nixon tapes that were used in evidence in the cover-up trial. The Supreme Court, again by a divided vote, in a significant ruling for First Amendment lawyers, concluded that there is no absolute right to access to evidence admitted in a criminal trial. So what they held was a common law right of access to evidence had to yield to other legitimate considerations. So those are the major constitutional cases in which the president was involved. As I say, no other president has had that sort of legacy. But there were other consequences of the Nixon presidency that I think have shaped the public policy, public law landscape quite significantly. In reaction to the Watergate scandals, the class of 1974 in Congress was the most obstreperous class elected to Congress probably since the New Deal. What that class did, and it was overwhelmingly Democratic, was to throw out the congressional system that had been in place for generations, in which essentially committee chairmen selected by seniority determined what legislation would go forward and what it would look like. And the young Turks who asserted themselves in the post-Watergate election of 1974 have permanently changed the legislative landscape so that, whether you like it or not, there is now more diversity in Congress, but certainly more gridlock. It is harder to get anything accomplished in Congress because there are now 535 voices that need to be heard. That can be cacophony rather than just a few voices leading committee chairs. Campaign finance reform, a perennial issue that has been the subject of presidential campaigns for the last 25 years, got a head of steam going in the Nixon era. One of the task forces in the special prosecutor's office was devoted to investigating campaign finance abuses of both Republicans and Democrats. There were a number of Democratic contributors who were prosecuted, but the huge influx of campaign financing from interested donors in the 1972 campaign in particular so exercised the public that the subject of campaign finance reform has been on the front burner ever since. As many of you know, last year Congress passed the so-called McCain-Feingold-Shays bill, which many people rue. It will shortly be the subject of First Amendment constitutional challenges. Others applaud. Some say it doesn't go far enough. The Watergate era and President Nixon's involvement and the experience with the special prosecutor also led Congress to enact a statute that survived for 20 years, the Independent Counsel Act, or the Ethics in Government Act, which led to the creation of 20 additional special prosecutors investigating every president or every administration after President Nixon, until Congress finally had enough of it and let it expire in 1999. But that, too, changed the nature of the president's role and the nature of the presidential administration in American public life, because anybody coming to Washington to serve in a cabinet position had to recognize, as unfortunately too many executives in both Republican and Democratic administrations thereafter learned, that they were likely to wind up on the wrong end of an independent counsel investigation, where an independent counsel with a virtually unlimited budget could spend years trying to determine whether or not that cabinet secretary or White House aide deserved to be indicted. 20 of those investigations took place. Several $100 million was spent of taxpayer money, with relatively few convictions. Some of the convictions were ultimately overturned on appeal or pardoned. Finally, I think most timely as a legacy, a legal legacy of the Nixon administration, is the War Powers Resolution. Ray and Ollie have mentioned the president's foreign policy initiatives. They, of course, mentioned the cataclysm that was Vietnam and the long-term commitment of over 500,000 men to combat in Vietnam. In 1973, Congress reacted to that by passing a War Powers Resolution that purportedly restricted the president's power to maintain foreign military operations. But it's actually had, I think, the opposite effect. What it has done, as experience in Kuwait, the Gulf War in 1991, the operations in Afghanistan, and the recent vote concerning Iraq all illustrate, it actually liberates Congress from having to make the hard choice to declare war, which sounds so much more ominous, so much more decisive, so much more grave. And Congress can simply do what it has done most recently with Iraq under the cover of the War Powers Resolution, say it's up to the president to decide whether to commit American troops, and we're authorizing that discretion, and this constitutes set compliance with the War Powers Resolution. So in a sense, in terms of blood and treasure, the most significant and most timely consequence, legal consequence, of the Nixon era may be the enactment of the War Powers Resolution and its facilitation of foreign military operations upon which we seem about to embark. Just a final coda. People mentioned President Nixon's accomplished abilities. Some 17 years or so after Watergate, and I had served the president with the first subpoena for the tapes. I had not seen him since he left office. And when I was at Morgan Stanley, one of my responsibilities was for government relations, and my government relations director said President Nixon was going to be giving a private briefing for contributors. This was in the 1992 campaign, and there was going to be a photo op that went with it. And I said, I'm going to that. The president gave a tour de force performance. This was, I guess he was 80 years old or so. For an hour and 15 minutes, spoke without notes about domestic policy, economic policy, foreign policy. Analytically, whether you agreed or disagreed, it was cogent, it was persuasive, it was organized. And I reflected, before I went up to get my picture taken with him, what a tragedy it was that, as Ray said, he could have been a great president. Maybe history in retrospect will say he was a great president, but for Watergate. But Watergate was real, and it was the end of the Nixon legal legacy. Thank you.
In a kind of epilogue to these four presentations, I'll ask Ray and Ed briefly, just in a few minutes each, to speak about the president's final years. The president resigned in 1974 and died in 1994, so there were 20 years in which he lived in a retirement, and I think it will be helpful if Ed and Ray speak to those years, and then, with fully 1/4 of our time remaining, we will begin to ask you to join in this discussion as well.
Shall I start? Well, I must say it's an uncommon honor for me to find myself in a law school anywhere in the world, and I must thank the Dean Bartlett and all of you here for participating. This is an education to me. I've avoided the law because, not because I don't love it, but because I've always been in trouble with it. I think when I left Duke, I had about 30 traffic tickets driving between East and West Campus. But it didn't stop me from getting into the Navy and flying jets and so forth. So, in fact, they kind of liked that idea. So, by and large, the latter years after the resignation, which, by the way, I always look at as a resignation in honor, Richard Nixon honored the office. He held it in the highest regard. He loved this country right to the end. He loved Duke, even though they kind of spit on him here and there, and supported it financially and otherwise to the end of his days. So I always reflect on those years up till '94, and I tried to summarize something talking with ABC at the funeral and other places. What do I think about it? What do I remember about it? I remember one event during the campaign of '72. I was touring the country, making little speeches, and I had a call from the White House when I was in Charlotte, just about to meet the advance man who had arranged a very large audience. And the President had ordered me to come up to Washington to talk to him at Camp David. And Ray Price will remember this because when I arrived at Andrews, Ray Price was there, and we took off in the helicopter and went up to Camp David for my first and only visit to the top of Mount Catoctin. My only time I ever had in a sauna, too. For Ole's privilege, Ole being Finnish knows what I'm talking about. For an American who's averse to icy cold water and not too sure of very, very hot steam, that was an experience, but Dick insisted I do it, and his sense of humor is always with me to the end of my life, I guess. I think that the final years were mainly what I appreciate most are the books that he wrote. Not everyone is inclined to read them, but there's a lot of wisdom in them. And the one most cogent, I just had a call just a couple of weeks ago from an old Carter administration friend of mine who was he's in Southern California, and he called and asked if I had read Beyond Peace, which was Dick's final book, which was published after his funeral. And I said, yes, of course. What do you have in mind? He says, you have to read it again. Right there in the middle on page 140, 141. It's the most prescient thing I've read. And pointing to this axis of evil thing involving Iran and so forth. And my own personal theory, thinking about all those times we've talked about one country or another. We love to visit those countries. We love to learn what those people think. And this is what I learned from the man is never presume anything until you hear what they have to say and why they are like they are. And you may not like what you see, but they will change, and so will you. In fact, before I made my first trip to China in 1983, I asked Dick on several occasions, should I go? This looks like a good business opportunity. He says, no, not ready yet. Well, afterwards, I realized he meant that I wasn't ready yet. But on that first trip, it was an extraordinary contrast to what I see today, in that there were the Mao suits, and they were still in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And today, it's a market economy. There are no communes. There's still a central committee that makes the laws and regulations and punishes those who break the laws. Can't disagree with that. If you're in a country and a citizen of the country and the law is broken, you have to pay the price. But then I met some other people there, and we talk about the Bible Belt down here and all that, and I still have great respect for it. I met some missionaries in Taiyuan City, Xi'an province. No, Shanxi province. Taiyuan City. And this was the son of a missionary, Christian missionary, who'd been there in World War II. His grandfather had been killed in the bombing, in the Japanese bombing. And I asked him, what's it like? You're back here now. He said, I was invited to come back. They wanted me to come back and open up a mission in Taiyuan. I said, well, can you bring Bibles and things in here and hold classes? Yes, there's no problem, as long as you tell them what you're doing. And as long as you don't try to smuggle the Bibles, you can bring as many as you want. They just need to know everything you're doing. So there may not be any privacy, but there is progress. And especially the businessmen. They're such eager, commercial, hot-to-trot people that I just really I like traveling the world, and I hope all of you have as much chance as I've had. Sorry.
Thank you. Ray?
Okay, let's see, I'll try to time myself. If I begin to run over, just give me the hook, okay? I spent a good deal of those last 20 years with him. I helped him with his first 3 books and his last 2, came back to New York from California with the Nixons when they came back. He was still the same person, but he led obviously a very different kind of life out of office than he had in. It was somewhat more like what he had done between 1962 and 1980, but now he was freed of responsibilities and he was never going to run for office. But he had a compelling need to be useful, and he knew that he understood the world, and he wanted very much to communicate as much as he could, and he had a phenomenal analytical capability, which other leaders knew that he had, and he tried to use that. He was always thinking. He was a voluminous reader. He was an intellectual who pretended not to be, unlike some people who do it the other way around, and a voluminous reader, especially of history and the ways of the world and so forth and the nations. And I guess it was about 8 or 9 books he did, or 7 or 8, I think, post-presidency. He kept turning them out, all serious ones. He worked hard at these. He also got a lot of satisfaction out of them. And also, I noticed this also in office too. When he did, for example, in the White House, I was saying before to David that about 1 out of 20 speeches was written, about 19 out of 20 were not, because he was always more comfortable without a text than with one. But whenever we did do a speech or something like that, he would often use, and he did this very much in the books, he would use the writing process in part as a means of refining ideas. And this was one of the things he did in the books that he wrote. He would tackle problems and work them out as he was writing the book. Always about what was happening in the world and how we could make it better, in a sense, how we could handle the challenges we had. One thing that to me summed up a lot of the way he handled himself and was accepted in the latter years. I traveled with him a fair amount before, during, and after the presidency, including his last trip to Asia the year before he died, 1993. He took Bibi Raboso, Bob Applinoff, and me along on it. It was a 3-week trip, of which 2 weeks were actually in China, South Korea, rather in Japan, South Korea, China, and Hong Kong, in that order. And he always got a kick out of historic firsts. And as we were coming into Beijing, a little light went on in my head, and I grinned and I turned to him and said, you know, I think you've just done another historic first without checking it. I doubt that anybody before in history has ever, on one day in Tokyo, conferred separately, privately, substantively, seriously with 4 Japanese prime ministers, the incumbent and 3 predecessors. The next day in Seoul, done the same with 3 South Korean presidents, the incumbent and 2 predecessors, and then gone on to meet with all the leaders of China. And the key to that was that he wanted to pick their brains, but they wanted to pick his brain because they knew it was worth picking, because they knew that he was always thinking, always strategizing, usually 7 or 8 steps ahead on the chessboard, and that they could usefully learn from him. And that was at the age of 80, when a lot of other people are not doing that. But that was the Richard Nixon. That was the way he conducted himself in those in those post-presidency years. There was the time he almost died, and when he had a blood clot got loose in his leg after he'd had phlebitis, and it was touch and go for about 3 days whether he'd live or die. There were crowds outside the hospital in Long Beach saying, "Let him die! Let him die! Let him die!" Nice people. That was some of what we'd been up against during the presidency. But he did survive. He was a survivor, and he always whenever he traveled abroad, he would check with the American ambassador wherever he was, see if there were anything that he could be of help to that ambassador with in his talks with the leaders, because often they would trust him more than they would the ambassador. And also he would always give a private report to the president, whoever it was, on what he had learned that might be of use to the president. He was always just trying to be useful, and I think he was right up until he died very suddenly. He was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. He was sitting out on the deck of his house in New Jersey. He had just gotten, I think it was the galley proofs of Beyond Peace. That day, he'd been up that weekend at Bob Aplenop's daughter's wedding, having a wonderful time, sitting there very happy with ease. Suddenly, the stroke. He had done a DNR, went into the hospital. That was Monday. He died on Friday. The family knew this was happening from about Wednesday on. David and Julie and Tricia and Ed were, his daughters and sons-in-law were talking with me about funeral arrangements and so forth. And then he died on Friday without ever really regaining consciousness. So it was a good, quick end, but it was an end when he was at the top of his form, at the age of 80.
Thanks to all the panel members, and now we invite you all to join in this discussion. These are the rules. They're very few and very simple. At this point, the microphones in front of you and your desks will be activated, and so please take care not to bump them unnecessarily or to cover them with papers. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, you can raise your hand and I'll recognize you, and I assume that you'll speak within some decent limitation. We ask only civility. You may comment if you like or ask a question. You may address the question to a member of the panel or at large, and when the time ends at 8 o'clock, we will stop. So we can begin. Yes.
I just want to say thank you. You guys were all great. My question was, you spoke about how Nixon's legacy to each of us here at Duke Law School is something different, and you also referenced the point about how it's kind of a crystal ball and you see what you want to in the man. And I think we all struggle with, at Duke, what it means to have him as an alumni. But I was interested in hearing if you guys could share any thoughts on what it meant to him to be an alumni of Duke, and what place Duke Law had in his life, and what he thought about it.
Let me get a shot at it, and you finish it off. What I remember about it, I just walked across the campus today, looked at that statue of, which one is it up there in front of the chapel? Is that one of the Duke boys, yeah. And I remembered that I had at home, I had just come across a little black and white snapshot that my brother Don had taken when I was here for Dick's graduation in 1937. I was 7 years old, standing there with my 82-year-old grandmother. We'd all traveled across country in a little car, and Dick took me down to the Whippoorwill Manor, they called it, where they survived for 3 years to finish law school. Bill Perdue, I think, who finished ahead of him in that class. But they did it, burning newspapers in the morning in the potbelly stove, running up to the law library, shaving and cleaning up, and then going on about the day. He never regretted any of that. In fact, he appreciated it. It was tough. And yeah, he came to be known as the Iron Butt, because he said, if you're going to get through law school, you got to have an iron butt. Well, most of you know what that means by now, and he was always so proud of having been here, and proud that I got through it as well. Not as well as he, but I mean I got through it. So.
Well, Duke always meant a lot to him. And there's a law school that meant a lot. The law had meant a lot to him. And but they were tough years, but interesting and very important years to him here. And it did hurt him when Duke refused the library very much. I think the fact that he offered the library to Duke tells you all you need to know.
I can add one anecdotal thing to what you've asked, to the answer to the question you've asked. When he was president, he actually invited the members of the class of '37 to come to dinner. Do you remember that, Ray? And they went, and they had a wonderful time. And I actually knew members of the class. One of my own very closest professional associates was a member not of that class, but of an adjacent class. So they were classmates. His name was Eddie Rubin, and Eddie always spoke of the president in the most glowing terms. He said he was somebody that you could make friends with and remain friends with. And so there was, I think, a sense, not only on the president's part, of a continuing community with the people here at Duke whom he had known, but a reciprocal feeling on the part of his classmates. Whatever his public life may have been, there was a private, personal life that meant something to the people who had known him. At least I can speak to this from having spoken to them. Are there additional questions? Yes, Chris?
I remember the televised memorial service at Yorba Linda and that snapshot of all of the living presidents standing together. And Ray, your remark at the end about how the president would give a private report to the sitting president whenever he returned from a foreign trip made me wonder if you could say some more about what his relationships were once out of office to the sitting president and how they differed from person to person as he moved through the Ford presidency and then up to the Clinton presidency.
Well, of course, Jerry Ford had been an old friend of his for many years, from the House days and so forth, and of course he had picked Ford as his own vice president, and that was always very cordial. He was, whoever it was, had immense respect for the office, and whoever held it, he thought it was very important that he do what he could to make that person successful in it, and so he would when he would try to fill them in on what he had picked up that might be useful, he would be focusing on what would be useful to the president rather than to that president. He had a very cordial relationship with Reagan. He had a very cordial one with Ford, obviously. Less so, I think, with Carter and with Clinton, but they got along. Instead of just his friendships transcended party too. For example, he became very friendly in his later years with Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York, and it was reciprocated. He always got along well with serious people, and he did not have a lot of patience with non-serious people. But he had an immense reverence for the office and wanted to be of help to whoever held it.
I can add an anecdote to that. It seemed each time I went to visit him in the latter years, my visits were always interrupted with a call from the White House, and cut it short. In fact, one of them, I was introducing an expatriate from Libya who was really trying to get a meeting with him to think about getting back in and getting Muammar Gaddafi out. And that meeting was interrupted. The red phone called, and President Reagan had been shot. So that meeting was truncated immediately, of course. But he was always attentive to the presidency. That office was in such high regard that that was first priority. Whatever he could do to enhance it, to keep America strong with the best leadership possible, no matter who was in office. And that was the way he was.
I'd like to just throw in, if I could, a little tangential thing on that. Back when we were working together on his resignation speech, people remember the emotional farewell to the staff from the East Room. I didn't even know he was going to do that. What I worked with him on was the Thursday night announcement that he would resign on Friday. And we were going through that, and he would explain to me how what he was trying to do in going through that week. We were up and down on this through a whole week. That he was going to resign, then he wasn't, then he was, and the last 3 days we were on the resignation. He was trying to go through that week because of his concern for the office itself, trying to do it in a way that would do as little damage as possible to future presidents. That was his prime concern in that week.
Yeah, Yes.
How would President Nixon have responded to September 11th, and what would Nixon the citizen have to say about President Bush's response?
You want me or?
Any one of you.
Well, it seems to me that virtually any president would have responded pretty much as President Bush did. It's a little bit like asking how would a president have responded to Pearl Harbor if it had not been Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, it's not much time to be thinking, was that a friendly act or a hostile act? It seems to me that we can't know for sure, but it would seem to me that Nixon's response would have been pretty much as President Bush's, but I think that would have probably almost any conceivable American president would have responded in the same way.
Yes.
Yes, I wanted to come back to the relations between President Nixon and the later presidents. I've read that President Clinton has said the best conversations he had in the White House were with President Nixon, and that would indicate a pretty close, intense relationship. Is this right? Do you know about that?
Frequent calls, I know that.
Yeah. Yeah, how personal as opposed to professional, I don't know. Maybe you know.
I don't
Yeah, I know they were in contact a lot, but and I know there were a lot of things about the Clinton administration he did not like, but he and I think they would almost certainly have been almost all of them, if not all of them, really on the foreign policy side.
Yes, in the very back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming and talking about our...
Can you be sure to move close to a mic? Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming to join us and talk about our fellow alums' legacy at Duke and in general. This is a question, I guess, directed to any of you. From listening to your points, it seems to me that there was a dual nature to his presidency, and that his striking victories or his wonderful legacy in foreign policy, but yet his disastrous and somewhat tragic domestic policies and legacy. And I was wondering if Nixon, in thinking about his legacy, was able to see this balance himself, and when he looked back, even though as he treasured the presidency and the office itself, and the reality was in a lot of ways he tarnished it. And I wondered if he felt that Watergate to himself was outweighed perhaps the opening up of China of things, or how he viewed his presidency in general.
Of course, Watergate looked very different from where we sat than it did from where other people sat. And again, I don't know, but having been his collaborator on all the Watergate speeches and so forth, having worked with the lawyers, and having looked at it since and what we've learned since, there's an awful lot that we know about the circumstances surrounding that now that we did not know then when we were trying to deal with it. And I really think that the reason we screwed it up so badly in the handling was all of us, including the president, were stumbling around in the dark, not knowing what we were dealing with. And that led to most of the problems we had. Even what brought the presidency down in the final time was when we had to turn over what became called the smoking gun tape. This was a conversation on June 23rd, 1972, just 6 days after the break-in, when Haldeman reported to him that he had been told that the dean had said that Mitchell said that there was a problem and he ought to try to get the CIA to head the FBI off of Mexico, out of something in Mexico, and he okayed it. And this is something, if we'd known about this earlier, we could have handled this easily. But at the end, we were so weak, A, we were so weakened, and B, we had made our case based on his argument that confronted with this after the fact, and he did not know anything about it before that. After the fact, he tried to get all the facts out. We could have handled it, but having done that, at this point, nobody was going to believe anything we said. And once that went out, it was catastrophic, calamitous. The reaction that was put out on Monday, the reaction Tuesday was boom, we were dead in Congress. And it was Tuesday he made the decision to go back on the resignation course, though this was still very secret. And but that was it. But and incidentally, that was I think in his own mind, though he remembered there had been such a conversation 2 years earlier, and a lot of things had happened in those 2 years. It wasn't the only thing he'd been thinking about. That I think he thought that in his own mind he had taken care of that, because in actual fact, the only practical effect of that, and that intervention was made. Dick Walters, the deputy head of the CIA, who was an old friend, did call Pat Gray, the acting head of the FBI, and Gray backed out of the Mexico thing. But then 2 weeks later, Gray called the president, said, the CIA now tells me they have no problem with Mexico. And Nixon told him, okay, go ahead, do a full investigation. They did. And the actual practical effect of that intervention that ultimately brought down the presidency was a delay of 2 weeks in the interviews of two witnesses, nothing more. That's just one example of things that could have come out differently if we'd known what we're dealing with. And I still don't know what Watergate was all about. It makes no sense at all, and it never made any sense to him either.
In the back, yes.
I was curious, your characterization of sort of how everything played out, no matter where you're coming from the point of view of why it happened or whose fault it was or anything like that. I was wondering if any of you could respond to the legacy as it is for the American people, not so much sort of what Congress has had to do or how constitutional law is developed, but the legacy that the American people take with them and have taken with them over this period of time in the way we view the presidency, in the sort of change of attitude and level of trust and things like that.
Could I take a crack at that? It certainly had a huge impact at the time, and in part a healthy aspect, because we're not a monarchy, and it's well to have presidents scrutinized and so forth. But it also got mixed with an awful lot of cynicism, and cynicism can be very corrosive. That happened then. It's been coming back. I must say, though, I'd like to add another thing on that, in terms of why I say that I felt we were on the right side, not of Watergate, but of the whole complex of things, not of just the Watergate thing itself. The rules were changed for Richard Nixon. Practically all the things he was accused of were things that had been normal in past administrations. I remember, for example, once in San Clemente during the height of all this, I was sitting with Rosemary Woods, his secretary, a long time friend, when she got a call from Jimmy Roosevelt, FDR's son, sixth-term Democratic congressman from Connecticut. Roosevelt was furious, not at Nixon, but at his Democratic colleagues in Congress for what they were trying to do, and he told Rose everything they even accuse him of, Father did twice as much of. And that was part of the frustration on our part there. But somewhere along the way, I think we may get back to a balance. We may or may not be there yet, in which we hold the right level of respect, but we don't stand in too much of an awe.
Philip Lacovara?
I have two responses, one to the immediate question and another to response to Ray. I think there was definitely a diminution of public respect for all public figures, a general increase in cynicism, and that certainly undermined the Ford administration and Carter's administration. I think the presidency bounced back. It shows how resilient the country is. Ronald Reagan became enormously popular and believable, and Bill Clinton did his best, of course, to forfeit that newfound respect for the presidency and brought the office into disrepute again. But it's bounced back, whether it was September 11th and George W. Bush's response to it or not. I think most political observers would say that there is a good deal of public support for, trust in the president today. So whatever the damage that was done to the office of the president by the Watergate affair of President Nixon, I think has largely dissipated. I do have to say that I don't think the characterization of what went on in the Oval Office as being as minuscule and insignificant as some would suggest is accurate. I mentioned at the outset of my remarks that I was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. I was shocked and disgusted when I first heard my first White House tape. Not only the conduct in the Oval Office, but the collectivity of what we heard showed the president's orchestrating the cover-up over the course of many months. And my basic justification for doing this as a Republican is that there's no Democratic or Republican way to enforce the law. Perjury is perjury. Subordination of perjury is subordination of perjury. Obstruction of justice is obstruction of justice. Franklin Roosevelt may have done it. Lyndon Johnson may have done it. I wasn't there. I was there in 1973 and 1974, and I have no regrets about the substance of what was done by the prosecution, and it's the consequences that are regrettable.
Yes.
I guess this is for Mr. Price and Mr. Lacovara. Do you think that once it became public that these tapes did exist, do you think that if right then he had come out and released unedited versions, do you think that would have been enough to stop what happened later, or do you think the result would have been the same?
I don't think, actually, even if he'd wanted to, I don't think he could have. They were, I never heard them. I know Rose Woods, who had to transcribe them long before they were known, parts of them. She told me it took 25 hours to try to transcribe 1 hour of that. And even so, there was a lot you couldn't get. They were not good tapes. They were very badly done. But also, he felt very strongly, quite apart from on the constitutional issue of the privacy of presidential confidentiality, and he was very adamant on that. A little parenthetical aside on what Philip talked about on when the Supreme Court came down. If you look at the statement he put out when he after the court did, you'll see that he did not say he was complying. He said he was accepting, and this was deliberate. At least it was deliberate for me when I wrote it, and I think it was in his in his mind too, because by accepting rather than complying, and at the same time giving as one of his rationale that the court did recognize the principle of executive privilege, then that way, by doing that, he was preserving the privilege for future presidents.
We have time for one more question. You had your hand up before.
Given his reverence for the office, do you think President Nixon would have advised President Clinton to resign in the aftermath of the Lewinsky scandal and the impeachment process?
I doubt that he would have presumed to do so.
I think I don't know the man, but I think he sure should have, if he had the opportunity.
If anything, he certainly would have told them, whatever you do, preserve the honor of the office. That's foremost.
That seems a good note upon which to conclude these proceedings. I hope you'll join in thanking our guests for And I believe that there are refreshments somewhere nearby, and if so, we're all joined.